Hi everyone, I'm Casey. Today I want to tell you about Margaret, a mother who spent her whole life building a home, only to realize she was seen as a burden by her own children at her husband's funeral. Join me as we listen to her story and see how sometimes silence is not a sign of weakness, but the beginning of a fair judgment. The heavy oak door of our Savannah home clicked shut, finally cutting off the relentless drumming of the rain outside. I stood there in the foyer, still wrapped in my old black cardigan, feeling a chill that did not come from the weather. It was the silence. It started at my feet and crawled upward, cold and unforgiving. James was not there to take my coat anymore. He was not there to tell me the tea was already steeping. The funeral was over, but in the hollow stillness of this house, my grief was only just beginning to take a shape I could finally recognize. I moved toward the kitchen by sheer muscle memory. 40 years of habit guided my hands as I reached for 2 porcelain cups. My fingers brushed the smooth rims before I froze. 1 cup remained on the shelf, already wearing a thin, mocking layer of dust. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway suddenly grew louder, hammering against my chest like a gavel. I brewed a single cup of Earl Grey. No sugar, no cream. The sharp bitterness bit at my tongue, but I welcomed it. It was the only thing I could feel. I sat in my usual chair and looked across the table. James's seat was a void, a gap in the world that felt wide enough to swallow me whole. I strained to hear anything. The hum of the refrigerator, the wind whistling through the window screen, desperate to drown out the ringing in my ears. I looked down at my hands. My knuckles were swollen and aching from arthritis, throbbing in the damp air. And I realized then that I had become a ghost in the very home I had built. The phone on the counter remained silent. I must have checked it a dozen times in the last hour. I was waiting for Oliver, my only son, the boy I had poured every ounce of my youth and strength into raising. I just wanted to hear his voice. I just needed him to ask if I was okay. This morning at the cemetery, I had hoped he would come back here for dinner, so we could sit and talk about his father. But the screen stayed dark until a sudden chime broke the quiet. It was not a call. It was a brief text from Oliver. He said that Emma wanted to go celebrate at a 5-star steakhouse because they were finally done with the exhausting funeral arrangements. He told me to just get some rest. He said he was busy. He said he would see me next week. Celebrate. The word echoed in my mind like a scream. They were out celebrating while James's body was barely cold beneath the damp earth. I closed my eyes and saw Emma at the graveside again, her vibrant red dress a jagged wound against the sea of black. Outside, the neighborhood was alive. I could see the glow from the windows across the street and hear the muffled laughter of children playing in the park nearby. The world was still turning, but inside these 4 walls, the air had grown too heavy to breathe. I pulled my knees up on the recliner, my shoulders sagging under the crushing weight of betrayal. I did not cry. The tears had all stayed behind at the cemetery. Now, there was only a vast, hollow emptiness where my heart used to be. I forced my trembling legs to carry me away from the recliner and toward the old oak bookshelf in the corner of the dim living room. In the faint shadows, the worn leather of the family album seemed to call out to me, its brown surface scuffed by decades of life. As I ran my fingers over the spine, I could feel the microscopic scratches and the weight of the years it held inside. When I finally pulled it from the shelf and opened the first page, the scent of aged paper and the faint, lingering ghost of pine needles from Christmases past rushed out to meet me, making my chest tighten with a sudden sharp ache. Under the dim yellow glow of the lamp, the photograph seemed to pulse with a life that had long since vanished. There we were, James and I, 30 years ago, our faces radiant with a joy that felt untouchable as we sat behind a Thanksgiving spread overflowing with turkey, cornbread, and laughter. For 3 decades, this kitchen never went cold during the holidays. It was the beating heart of our world. I remember the 15 long years I spent working double shifts at the department store, my feet throbbing in the sensible shoes I wore to save every possible penny for Oliver's college fund. I was so happy back then, watching him grow tall and strong, believing that every sacrifice James and I made was a brick in the foundation of his future. James used to take my hand and tell me that our devotion was the greatest gift we could ever give him. But as I turned the pages, the smiles in the photographs began to thin, and the spaces between us grew wider. That was when Emma appeared, and slowly, the colors of our family life began to fade. The weekly phone calls that used to last an hour dwindled into monthly check-ins that felt more like obligations. "I am busy, Mom," became the anthem of Oliver's life every time I tried to invite them over for a Sunday roast. Emma began to systematically replace my place in every plan he made, pushing me to the periphery of his world. The fishing trips he used to take with his father were replaced by lavish parties with Emma's high society friends. Gatherings where an old woman like me was never meant to have a seat at the table. I tried to tell myself he was just an adult now, that he needed his own life. But the realization that I was being erased was a slow-acting poison that seeped into my heart every single day. I stopped at the picture of Oliver's graduation day, his eyes bright with ambition. I remember exactly how he hugged me that afternoon and promised that once he got his promotion and settled down, he would take James and me on a cruise through the Caribbean, the one I had dreamed of for a lifetime. I held on to that promise like a sacred treasure for years. But the reality was a bitter pill to swallow. When the promotion finally came, Oliver bought a mansion for Emma, and that Caribbean vacation was reserved for their elite circle of friends, while I sat at home, waiting for a call that never came. I realized then that I was no longer a mother in their eyes. I was merely a dusty relic, a memory that belonged in the attic, rather than in their bright new lives. I finally closed the album, the sound of the cover meeting the pages as dry and final as a closing door. I did not feel hatred for my son, but the cold truth was undeniable. I had been traded for material status and Emma's shallow pride. I placed the album back on the shelf, my hand trembling as I smoothed over the thin layer of dust that had already begun to resettle. James was gone, and now the children I had once considered my very life had left me behind in this silent, hollow house. I took a deep breath, forcing the lump in my throat back down, and looked out the window where the rain showed no sign of stopping. The rain in Savannah feels like it has been falling forever, ever since James was laid to rest. Tonight, the damp cold is persistent, sneaking through the old window frames and settling deep into my bones. I struggled to stand, my heart fluttering with that familiar sharp anxiety that only heart medication seems to dull. I did not want to be a bother to anyone, so I made a silent promise to myself that I would be fine on my own. But this silent, empty house, once filled with laughter and the smell of Sunday roast, now feels like it is actively working against me. I reached up for the glass vial on the high kitchen shelf, my fingertips just brushing the cool surface, when a sudden wave of dizziness hit me. The floor was slick from a leak I had not the strength to fix, and in a heartbeat, my feet went out from under me. A sickening crack echoed through the kitchen, followed by a white-hot pain that tore through my hip and spine. I hit the floor hard, the medicine bottle shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces, sending those tiny white pills skittering far out of my reach. I lay there, gasping for air, feeling the icy bite of the tile against my skin. A paralyzing fear gripped my throat, not of death itself, but of the thought that I might lie here for days, forgotten and rotting in total isolation. With the last ounce of my strength, I dragged my arm toward the phone that had tumbled onto the rug. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely punch the buttons for Oliver's number. It rang and rang, each tone sounding like a death knell, before dropping into the hollow void of his voicemail. I tried again, and then a third time, praying for the sound of his voice. Finally, the screen lit up with a brief, cold text message from my son. He told me that he was in the middle of a major fundraiser for Emma and asked if I could stop disturbing them. He said he would call back later. I tried Emma next, but she did not even bother to open the message. I stared at the darkening screen, feeling the betrayal slice through me more deeply than the broken bone ever could. I had spent my entire life sacrificing so they could stand in those glittering ballrooms, only for my own life to be treated as a mere inconvenience. My arm went limp, and the phone slid from my fingers onto the hard floor. The darkness in the kitchen seemed to thicken, pressing down on me until I could hardly breathe. I found myself wondering where I went wrong. Had I loved them too much? Or perhaps in the wrong way, until they forgot how to be human? A dangerous thought flickered through my mind. Why keep fighting? James is gone, and the children I once cherished as my very life have discarded me like an old coat. I lay there amidst the shards of glass and my own shattered memories, listening only to the steady rhythm of the rain on the roof, a lonely funeral march for the woman I used to be. Does a busy career justify leaving a mother alone in her hour of need? It's heartbreaking to see such indifference toward parents. Have you experienced this? Share your thoughts below. Let's listen to one another so no one has to face the crushing silence Margaret feels tonight. Your wisdom matters. I do not know how long I lay there on that cold kitchen floor. My consciousness flickered like the streetlights outside, struggling against the savannah storm. The pain in my hip had shifted from a sharp, white-hot scream to a terrifying, heavy numbness that seemed to seep into my very soul. In my delirium, I thought I heard the tolling of James's funeral bell again. But then, a different sound broke through the haze. It was a knock, followed by a voice, warm, steady, and filled with a frantic kind of worry. It was Lisa, the young attorney James had trusted with our most private matters. She was calling my name, telling me she had documents from James that couldn't wait. When I couldn't answer, she didn't just walk away. She sensed the silence was wrong and called 911. The next few hours were a blur of siren lights and the sterile, sharp smell of an ambulance interior. When the paramedics finally breached the door, I saw a blinding flash of light, and then Lisa's face, streaked with tears, as she looked down at me. She grabbed my hand, my thin, ice-cold hand, and she didn't let go. She whispered comforts to me all the way to the emergency room, promising me I wasn't alone. It was a bitter realization that, in this sprawling city, while my own son was likely laughing over expensive wine and steak, a woman I knew only through legal paperwork was the only one holding me back from the edge of the abyss. I woke up the next morning in a hospital bed, surrounded by the hum of machines and the heavy scent of antiseptic. My hip had been surgically pinned back together, a mechanical fix for a body that felt increasingly fragile. Lisa was still there, sitting in a plastic chair with a cup of Starbucks coffee that had clearly gone cold hours ago. She had spent the night navigating the labyrinth of my Medicare paperwork, ensuring everything was covered so I wouldn't have to worry about the cost of my survival. When I finally found my voice, I asked about Oliver. Lisa hesitated for a long time, her eyes filled with a pity that hurt more than the surgery. She handed me my phone. There were 10 missed calls to my son, and only one reply, sent at 3 in the morning. Oliver had texted that he was in the middle of a major project in Atlanta, and that Emma insisted my fall was probably just a minor scrape. He told me to have the nurses look after me, and said he would send money later. Send money. They truly believed that a few digital dollars could replace the warmth of a son's presence at his mother's bedside. When Lisa finally brought me home a few days later, she carried more than just my overnight bag. She held a small wooden box wrapped in black velvet. She placed it in my lap as I sat in my recliner, her voice dropping to a low, solemn tone. She told me that James had come to her office a month before he passed away. He had given her strict instructions that if anything ever happened and I found myself feeling truly alone, she was to give this to me. He had called it the family's final lifeboat. My hands, still shaky from the trauma, fumbled with the lid. Inside was a brown leather-bound diary, the one James always carried, the one he had never shared with a soul. I spent the rest of the afternoon turning those pages, my heart constricted with every word. James's handwriting was strong and full of the grace I remembered, but the content was a map of a betrayal I had been too blind to see. He had known everything. He had documented the times Emma had quietly siphoned money from our joint retirement accounts under the guise of helping us with bills. He had recorded the lies Oliver told about failing business ventures, lies meant to guilt us into paying off the gambling debts Emma had racked up at the casinos. James had kept it all inside because he feared my heart was too soft to survive the truth. In a passage written during his final week, he addressed me directly. He wrote that if I was reading this, he was no longer there to shield me from their greed. He told me not to be afraid, because he had prepared a path for me to find myself again. He stated clearly that our life's work did not belong to those who had no room for love or respect. Reading his words felt like a surge of electricity running through my spine. The lingering ache of my injury and the deep sorrow of my isolation suddenly transformed into a cold, sharp clarity. It was an awakening. James had left me more than an inheritance. He had given me the truth, a brutal but necessary weapon to break the chains of my own misplaced loyalty. I looked up at Lisa, who had been watching me with such quiet empathy, and I realized I was no longer a grieving widow waiting for the end. I was Margaret, and I had a final duty to perform for the man who had loved me enough to protect me, even from beyond the grave. I looked at Lisa, and my voice was steadier than it had been in years. I told her we needed to fulfill my husband's true, final wishes. It was time for my children to learn that the truth has a price they are not yet prepared to pay. 3 weeks after the accident, my home in Savannah began to welcome the warm rays of spring sun filtering through the ancient oak trees. The injury in my hip still reminded me of its presence, with a dull ache whenever the weather shifted. But James's diary, sitting on my bedside table, had become the most powerful spiritual painkiller I could ever ask for. I no longer looked at these 4 walls as a prison cell. I started practicing my walking, one slow step at a time, supported by the cold but sturdy metal of my walker. This morning, I decided to brew a pitcher of southern lemon tea myself, the kind James always said was the best in all of Georgia. I walked slowly out to the porch and sat down in our familiar wooden swing. Watching the long strands of Spanish moss swaying gently in the breeze, I realized I had been hiding from the world for far too long. I picked up the phone and called the garden service, asking them to come and prune the azalea bushes that had withered from neglect. Every clip of the gardener's shears felt like it was cutting away the dark, heavy shadows in my heart. I was cleaning up my life, starting right here in this garden. Just then, my phone vibrated in my lap. It was Oliver. This time, I did not rush to answer with that old, fragile hope for a sincere check-in. I took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh, sweet air, and then I answered. I told him I was listening. My son's voice came through, but he was not asking about my recovery. Instead, he started talking about how Emma wanted to bring some friends over to look at the house next weekend. He said she thought I should move into a smaller apartment where it would be easier for them to look after me. It was a calculated kind of care, one that felt more like a business transaction than a kindness. In the past, I probably would have stayed silent or given a forced smile and agreed just to keep the peace. But this time, I looked down at the words James had written in his diary. I told Oliver no. My voice was calm, but it was as solid as a foundation stone. I told him I appreciated Emma's intent, but this house was a part of me and his father. I told him I had no intention of leaving or letting any strangers in right now, because I was busy tending to my garden. I ended the call before he could even find a way to argue. A wave of relief washed over me. It did not feel like an attack. It felt like a shield, a way to protect my home and my dignity. In the afternoon, I put on my favorite floral dress and slipped into the comfortable flat shoes James had bought for our anniversary last year. I called an Uber, something I used to be terrified of because I did not understand the technology. As the car rolled away from my front gate and headed toward historic downtown Savannah, I looked out the window. The world was still so bright and so vast. I realized that as long as I did not lock myself inside my own pain, loneliness would never be able to defeat me. I was heading to the bookstore for the local ladies' reading club. It was finally time for Margaret to start a new chapter of her own. After I hung up the phone on Oliver and refused to let Emma turn my sanctuary into a real estate viewing, I felt a strange and powerful surge of energy through my veins. For the first time in years, I did not feel the crushing weight of guilt that usually followed whenever I failed to meet my children's demands. Instead, I felt the liberation of a woman who had finally rediscovered the boundaries of her own soul. It was as if a heavy fog had lifted from the Savannah marshes, allowing me to see the path ahead with startling clarity. This Sunday, instead of sitting by the kitchen table, waiting for a phone call that would never come, or a visit that was always too short, I decided to meet Lisa at a small fundraiser in Forsyth Park. I was no longer going to be a ghost in my own home. Savannah on a Sunday morning is a place of profound peace, where the world seems to slow down just enough for you to breathe. The ancient live oaks draped in heavy curtains of Spanish moss swayed gently in the breeze, providing a cool emerald canopy over the craft stalls and flower displays. I had spent the previous evening in my kitchen, which for the first time since the funeral felt warm and alive again. I baked a peach cobbler using the old family recipe James had always loved, the one with the extra dusting of cinnamon and the crust that stayed flaky even in the Georgia humidity. The scent of bubbling butter and sweet ripened peaches filled every corner of the house, acting like a spiritual balm for my weary heart. As I walked through the park, carrying the warm tray, I noticed the genuine smiles of the women at the volunteer booth. It had been so long since I felt useful to a community, rather than being an unpaid servant to the endless and ungrateful needs of my own children. That was when I met Anna, a young coordinator for the Children's Charity Foundation that James had mentioned so often in his diary. Anna had bright, curious eyes and a smile that seemed to catch the Georgia sunlight. She did not look at me with the veiled pity I often saw in my children's eyes, nor did she treat me like a fragile relic that needed to be managed. When she tasted a piece of my cobbler, her eyes lit up with genuine delight, and she told me it reminded her so much of her grandmother back in North Carolina. We sat together on a weathered stone bench under the oaks, talking about the foundation's work helping local children. I realized in that moment that the sincere interest of this young woman, a complete stranger, was warmer and more authentic than any visit Oliver had made in the last 5 years, where he usually spent half the time checking his watch and the other half asking about my bank balance. By the afternoon, the group had gathered for a potluck dinner in Lisa's backyard, and the air was thick with the comforting smells of traditional Southern barbecue and wood smoke. The sound of ice clinking against glass in pitchers of Earl Grey tea and the low hum of easy conversation created a symphony of belonging but I had thought was lost to me forever. I had brought my traditional potato salad, and as we sat around a large, weathered wooden table, I felt a sense of peace settle over me like a soft quilt. There was no judgment here, and no one made snide comments about my house being too large or my lifestyle being outdated. In this circle, I was simply Margaret, a woman with a lifetime of experience, a talent for baking, and a heart that still had so much to give. I began to understand that family is not strictly defined by the blood in your veins, but by the people who are willing to stand beside you when the storms of life start to howl. In the middle of that beautiful afternoon, my phone buzzed with an Instagram notification I had forgotten to turn off. I caught a glimpse of a photo Emma had just posted of herself on a luxury yacht, surrounded by her high society friends. Her caption read that she was finally enjoying life without being held back by family burdens. For a second, I felt a familiar sting in my chest. But then, I looked across the table at Anna, who was passionately describing a young boy the foundation had just helped with a life-saving surgery. I looked at Lisa, who was leaning over to pour me more tea, with a quiet and knowing smile. The contrast was staggering. On one side was a hollow glamour built on greed and cold calculation, while on the other was a simple and profound grace built on love. I took a deep breath, smiled to myself, and quietly turned off my phone notifications for good. I no longer belonged to that empty and selfish world. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the savannah sky in bruised purples and burnt oranges, Anna and Lisa walked me to my car. Anna squeezed my hand and asked if I would come back next Sunday because she was desperate to learn the secret to my southern fried chicken. That simple request brought tears to my eyes because it reminded me that I was not a burden to be managed, but a person of value with something worth sharing. I drove home through the quiet streets, feeling as light as the jasmine blossoms drifting on the evening breeze. I had found a new family, a chosen family, where love was given freely and not used as a bargaining chip for inheritance. When I finally walked back into my house, it no longer felt like a tomb of memories. The silence was peaceful rather than suffocating. I opened James's diary and found a fresh page to write him a message, telling him that I had finally found the people who would help me protect the legacy he worked so hard to build. I told him that I was no longer afraid of the shadows. This peace was the foundation I needed for the confrontation that I knew was coming, because I was well aware that Oliver and Emma would not stop at a few ignored texts. They would likely attack harder and with more cruelty. But I now had a spiritual fortress around me. I stood by the window, looking out at the street lamps, and felt a confidence I had never known before. I had once believed that losing James meant losing everything, but his passing had forced open a door I was always too scared to walk through. I did not need to beg for scraps of affection from ungrateful children. Love was already there, waiting for me, in the places I had never thought to look. The Margaret of today was finally ready for the final judgment, not out of a desire for revenge, but out of a deep and unwavering need for justice, for herself, and for the man who had loved her enough to set her free. The peace that Anna and Lisa brought into my life felt like a soothing balm, momentarily dulling the constant ache of loss that had settled in my chest since James passed. But I knew deep down that life in Savannah is rarely a perfectly still river for long. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the humidity hangs thick and the air smells of blooming jasmine and old wood. I was in the kitchen, carefully cleaning the delicate porcelain plates James and I had discovered together years ago in a dusty antique shop in New Orleans. They were more than just dishes. They were pieces of a shared history I was determined to preserve. Suddenly, the harsh screech of tires broke the afternoon quiet, followed by the heavy thud of car doors slamming shut in my driveway. I didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. The sudden frantic hammering of my heart against my ribs told me exactly who had arrived. Oliver and Emma. They never called ahead, especially not when they wanted something from me. When the front door swung open, Emma didn't look like the woman in the vibrant red dress I saw at the cemetery. She was wearing a perfectly tailored business suit, looking every bit the successful professional, and she held a large gift basket from Whole Foods, overflowing with expensive organic fruits. Oliver trailed behind her, looking uncomfortable and clutching a bouquet of carnations. I had told him a dozen times over the years that I was allergic to the pollen in carnations, but he had clearly forgotten, or perhaps he just didn't care to remember. "Oh, Mother, we missed you so much!" Emma exclaimed, her voice dripping with a sweetness that made my skin crawl. She rushed over to wrap me in an embrace, the overpowering scent of her Chanel perfume filling my lungs and momentarily choking me. It was a calculated display of affection, designed to make me forget that only a week ago she had treated me like an unwanted burden. They led me to the green velvet sofa in the living room, flanking me on either side like they were protecting me, though I felt more like I was being cornered. Oliver began to speak in a low, weary voice, his eyes fixed on the floor. He told me he was sorry for not calling, but that he had been under so much stress because his business in Atlanta was on the brink of collapse. He said he hadn't wanted to worry me with his failures. Emma immediately chimed in, reaching out to squeeze my thin hand. She pointed out how tired and thin Oliver looked, blaming his decline on his worry for both his career and for me. She suggested that if I sold this house that was far too large for a woman alone, I would have a massive retirement fund to live on. She painted a picture of a luxury apartment near them with 24-hour care, where I would never be lonely again. The extra money, she said casually, could help Oliver save his company. She asked if that wasn't what James would have wanted, for the family to help one another in times of need. If this had happened a month ago, I might have nodded through my tears, believing that my sacrifice was the only way to save my son. But the truth James had written in his leather diary burned in my mind like a searchlight. James had documented everything. The way Oliver had gambled away our savings at the casinos in Atlantic City, and how Emma was the one constantly pushing him for more. I looked Emma straight in the eyes, with a calm and steady gaze she had never seen from me before. I told her that James wanted us to help each other, with sincerity, not by stripping a widow of her last refuge. The silence that followed my words was so heavy, it felt like it was crushing the air out of the room. The mask of sweetness vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Emma's eyes narrowed, revealing a cold and jagged anger she usually kept hidden. She demanded to know what I meant by that, asking what I planned to do with this pile of old bricks when I couldn't even take care of myself. She reminded me sharply that I had already fallen once, asking if I had forgotten so easily. She stood up, her voice rising in a sharp, mocking tone that echoed off the high ceilings. Oliver kept his head down, offering no defense for his mother, only muttering that I shouldn't be so selfish when they were the ones suffering. Selfish. The word stung. I was the woman who had sold our first family home to pay off their earlier debts, and now I was being called selfish for wanting to keep the roof over my head? I didn't stand up, and I didn't raise my voice. I simply placed my teacup down on the wooden table, the soft clink of porcelain on wood sounding remarkably final. I told them they should take their gift basket back with them. I stated clearly that I would not be selling my home, and I would not be withdrawing a single cent from James's retirement accounts to throw into a bottomless pit of debt. I suggested that if they were truly struggling, they should learn the value of honest work, just as James had done his entire life. Emma let out a harsh, dry laugh and swept the gift basket off the table, sending organic apples rolling across the hardwood floor. She told me I would regret this, and warned me not to think that Lisa could protect me forever. They turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard that the family photos on the wall rattled in their frames. I sat there alone, my heart still racing. But it wasn't out of fear. It was out of pride. I had won the first battle for my own life. Is pressuring parents to sell their home family loyalty or emotional abuse? If you were Margaret, would you yield for peace or stand firm? We value your life experience on this. Share your thoughts below and reach out to a friend today. Let's look out for one another. After the calculated visit from Oliver and Emma, the air inside my Savannah home felt thick and stagnant, as if a tropical storm were brewing just off the Atlantic coast. I spent hours in James's old study, sitting in his oversized leather chair, where the scent of his pipe tobacco still lingered faintly in the wood. My thin fingers traced the worn edges of his brown leather diary, feeling every scratch and indent as if they were a map of the truth. These words were not just warnings. They were a devastating indictment of the rot that had consumed the very people I called my family. The crickets outside the window seemed to chirp with a sharper, more aggressive rhythm than usual, and I knew in my soul that this heavy silence was merely the precursor to a collapse that could never be repaired. The storm did not wait for the weekend as they had threatened. On Thursday night, the silence of the evening was shattered by a doorbell that rang with a frantic, repetitive urgency, as if someone were trying to physically tear the peace from my walls. When I pulled the heavy oak door open, Emma pushed her way inside first, clutching a thick manila folder to her chest like a shield. Oliver followed her, his face pale and his eyes darting toward the corners of the room as if he were looking for an exit before the conversation had even begun. They had dropped the act of sweetness entirely. The expensive scent of red wine radiated from Emma, mixed with a cold, jagged aggression that marked every step she took across my hardwood floors. She slammed the folder down on the dining table, the same table where we had shared decades of warm Christmas dinners and birthday cakes, and declared that they had already consulted with a specialist. She told me they had the paperwork ready to prove that I was no longer mentally fit to manage James's estate. "Look at this, Margaret," Emma said, and her voice was a low hiss that reminded me of a snake preparing to strike. She told me this was a preliminary assessment from a psychologist they had spoken to. She stood over me, accusing me of being paranoid and delusional since James's death, claiming that I was being manipulated by outsiders like Lisa, who only wanted to steal our family's money. Oliver stood there, leaning against the doorframe, without saying a single word to defend the woman who had brought him into this world. He just mumbled something about this being the only way to protect Dad's legacy. Seeing my son's weak, spineless surrender in that moment was far more painful than all of Emma's poison. They were trying to erase my mind and my agency right here in the center of my own home. A sudden heat began to rise from deep in my chest, spreading through my nerves until the ache in my hip seemed to vanish entirely under the sheer weight of my fury. I had spent a lifetime being patient and quiet, but I had reached the end of my endurance. I stood up straight, and my voice rang out with a sharp, iron quality that seemed to drown out the first heavy drops of rain hitting the tin roof. I asked them if they really wanted to talk about being mentally fit. I asked if we should instead talk about the stacks of bills from the Atlantic City casinos that they had tried so hard to hide from James. I asked about the secret offshore account Emma had been using to siphon away assets before Oliver's company officially hit rock bottom. I moved slowly to the drawer and pulled out James's diary, placing it on the table right next to their bundle of lies. I told them that James knew every single thing they had done. I told them he had recorded every time they lied to beg for money, and every time Emma mocked our simple life while she was busy spending my retirement savings. I opened the book to the page where James had detailed the conversation he overheard between them. A conversation where they talked about waiting for the old man to die so they could finally change their luck. As I read those words aloud, Emma's face shifted from a bright, angry red to a ghostly, sickly white, while Oliver began to shake like a child who had been caught in a terrible lie. The truth acted like a blinding light that forced them to physically recoil. Emma began to scream, and the sound was raw and ugly. She reached out and grabbed a porcelain bowl from the shelf, a memorial piece I had cherished, and hurled it against the floor with all her might. The sound of the ceramics shattering was deafening, and it felt like the final pieces of my heart were breaking along with it. "Ah!" She screamed that I was nothing but a selfish old woman, and that James was a fool for leaving everything to a living corpse like me. Oliver tried to grab her arm to stop the chaos, but she turned and slapped him across the face before unloading a string of insults on the husband she had already traded his mother's love to control. The room was a scene of absolute madness, where there once was only laughter. I stood there in the middle of the ruins of my memories and the total collapse of my family. I was not crying, because the pain had moved far beyond the reach of tears. I looked at Oliver, the boy I had stayed up with through every fever, and the man I once believed would be my strength in old age. I told him to take his wife and get out of my house immediately. I told them never to come back, with the intention of stealing what did not belong to them. I told them their father was right, and that they were not worthy of a single cent of the blood and sweat he had poured into this life. As they disappeared into the pouring rain, the sound of their car engine roared and then faded into the distance. I sat down slowly on the sofa and watched the shadows dance on the walls. The house was silent again, but it was a different kind of quiet this time. It wasn't the silence of lonely despair, but the hollow space left behind after a painful and necessary cleansing. I looked at my hands, and they were still trembling from the adrenaline and the anger, but I felt a strange and wonderful sense of relief. I had spoken the truth, and I was no longer a victim being managed and manipulated. I whispered to James that I had done it. I took a deep breath and smelled the damp earth and the rain-washed air as it drifted through the screen door. I was ready to take the final legal steps to protect myself and ensure that my future would remain my own. The roar of the car engine faded into the distance, leaving my Savannah home in a chilling silence. I knelt on the floor, my hands trembling, as I picked up the jagged shards of the porcelain bowl, which was a souvenir from a trip James and I took to New Orleans years ago. Emma had smashed it, just as she had tried to smash my heart and spirit. Looking into those broken fragments, I saw a reflection of myself as a mother who had been pushed aside and ignored. But the warmth of James's diary in my pocket acted as a steady reminder that I was not truly alone. I stood up and walked slowly toward his old study at the end of the hallway, where the familiar scent of cedar and old paper still lingered as if he had never left. I pushed the door open, and silver moonlight filtered through the blinds, illuminating the worn oak desk where James had sat for 40 years. I sat in his old leather chair, feeling the soft material that had worn thin and comfortable over time. On the desk, his reading glasses still lay next to an unfinished sketch. I closed my eyes, and in the deep quiet, I could almost hear his low laugh and the rhythmic scratch of his pencil on paper. James was never a man of flowery words or expensive gifts. He showed his love through his actions, like fixing a leaky faucet or quietly saving every penny so I could have the floral dress I had always wanted. I remembered an autumn afternoon many years ago when we sat on the porch watching Oliver play in the yard. James had taken my hand and told me that while money could build fancy castles, only sincerity could keep a home warm. He warned me never to let the glitter of the world blind my eyes to what was real. At the time, I had only smiled, thinking he was being too serious. Now, facing our son's extreme greed, I finally understand my husband's generous yet vigilant heart. He saw it all coming, and he prepared a path for me to follow, so I could protect the good values we had built together. I pressed the diary against my chest, feeling a strange and deep peace spread through me. The bitterness over Oliver's betrayal seemed to soften, replaced by a cold and steady determination. James had left me the truth, and that truth was my most powerful guide for what came next. I looked out the window where the old oak stood tall and defiant against the sea breeze. I realized I was no longer a weak widow waiting for scraps of affection. I am the keeper of this family's flame, and I will not let it be extinguished by selfishness. James, I whispered into the darkness, my voice no longer shaking. I promise you, I will not let them trample over everything we worked so hard to build. I will live, not just for myself, but for the dream of kindness and integrity you always cherished. I stood up and left the room, closing the door gently but firmly. My footsteps on the wooden hallway sounded steady and full of purpose. Tonight, I would sleep soundly, because I knew that tomorrow, the journey for justice would truly begin, and James was right there beside me. The house felt impossibly vast and strangely still after the hurricane of Emma and Oliver's visit had finally passed. I had swept up the jagged shards of the porcelain bowl, but a deep scratch remained on the oak floor, a permanent scar marking the moment my own children tried to steal my mind. I sat out on the front porch, watching the long gray veils of Spanish moss sway in the heavy Savannah heat. My heart was heavy with a question I couldn't quite shake. Was I being too hard on them? Was my pride clouding my judgment as a mother? But then, the rhythmic squeak of an old bicycle chain pulling up to my gate cut through the thick silence. A small, energetic figure hopped off the bike and waved. It was Anna. Anna didn't arrive with a rehearsed speech, a stack of legal threats, or a gift basket filled with expensive, impersonal fruits meant to bribe me. She walked up the steps, carrying a simple plastic container filled with warm, homemade cornbread, and wearing a smile that felt as bright as the Georgia sun. She told me she was just passing by and noticed my jasmine bushes looked a little thirsty, so she thought she would stop in for a moment. It felt so natural, as if we had been neighbors for decades, rather than strangers who had met through a charity foundation. She didn't ask about the drama or the shouting from the other night. She didn't pry into the details of the will or my bank balance. She simply helped me water the garden, then sat down on the swing beside me and poured us both a tall glass of southern sweet tea. Her presence was like a cool sea breeze, light, effortless, and entirely without an agenda. As I watched Anna carefully wipe a layer of dust off a framed photo of James on the side table, I felt a sharp, stinging warmth behind my eyes. Here was my own son, a boy I had carried for 9 months and taught to tie his own shoes, now looking at me as nothing more than a living bank account. Yet this young woman, whom I had only known for a few weeks, was genuinely worried about whether my arthritic hip was aching as the evening air turned damp. She talked to me about the children at the foundation, describing the way their faces lit up when they received the old toys I had donated. Sitting there with her, I didn't feel like a confused old woman or a burden to be managed. I felt like a grandmother. I felt like a friend. I felt seen. Anna reached over and gently squeezed my hand, her touch light and kind. She told me that her own grandmother in North Carolina had once been manipulated out of her family home by people she trusted. She said she wished back then her grandmother had someone like Lisa standing in her corner to fight for her. She told me she was helping me because she saw the same light in my eyes that her grandmother once had. That simple admission made me realize a profound and beautiful truth. Love is not a debt that must be repaid, and it isn't something that can be demanded through blood alone. It is a resonance between souls who truly understand one another. James was right to lead me toward this foundation. He didn't just want me to give my money away. He wanted me to find the sincerity and connection that our children had lost somewhere along the way. Having Anna there that evening was like a life-saving medicine for my exhausted spirit. She helped me understand that even if Oliver turned his back on me, the world was still filled with goodness and grace. I realized I wasn't fighting this battle in total isolation anymore. Every word of encouragement she gave me, every bright, honest laugh she shared, was another brick in the wall I was building to protect my dignity. When it was time for her to leave, I pulled her into a tight hug. There was no scent of Emma's suffocating, expensive perfume, only the smell of the sun and warm cornbread. I stood on the porch and watched her bike disappear under the glow of the street lamps, whispering to myself that I still had every reason to be strong. I wasn't just doing this for James. I was doing it for pure, unbought affection like this. Have you ever received genuine help and love from a complete stranger while your closest relatives hurt you? Should we place our trust in chosen family instead of enduring toxic blood relationships? Share your story in the comments. The morning sun in Savannah no longer felt like a burning weight on my shoulders or a weary reminder of the long days I had spent in mourning. As I stood before the full-length mirror in my bedroom, carefully smoothing the lapels of my navy blue blazer, the one James always said made me look like the most elegant woman in Georgia, I saw someone I had not seen in years. I saw a woman who was finally awake. I was no longer that thin, trembling widow who had clung to her old black cardigan at the funeral, terrified of the silence. My reflection showed me a Margaret who had walked through the fire of betrayal and come out with a cold, clear vision of the future. Anna's visit the previous evening had provided the final piece of the puzzle I needed to move forward. I realized then that I did not owe anyone an apology for protecting the fruits of a lifetime of hard work. I picked up the thick envelope of documents Lisa had prepared, took a deep, steadying breath of the sweet magnolia scent drifting through the open window, and walked out to my car with a stride that was more certain than it had been in decades. Lisa's office was nestled inside a beautiful historic building on the edge of the square, all warm red brick and soaring windows that let in the dappled light from the ancient oaks outside. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet and solemn, a world away from the ugly shouting and calculated chaos that Oliver and Emma had brought into my living room just days before. Lisa looked at me from across her polished desk, and I saw a deep respect and encouragement in her eyes that moved me more than I could say. She asked me if I was absolutely sure about this, reminding me that once I signed these papers, the legal path I was setting would be very difficult to change. I did not hesitate for a single second. I gave her a smile that came from a place of profound peace. I told her I had never been more sure of anything in my life. James had already laid the foundation and pointed the way, and now I was simply finishing the journey he started. I picked up the pen and began to sign the revised will, each stroke of ink feeling like a deliberate step toward my own freedom. The portion of the estate that was originally meant for Oliver, the money James and I had scraped together from those long, grueling shifts at the shipyard when we were young, was now being redirected. It was moving into an educational trust for underprivileged children and a support fund for neglected seniors across Georgia. I was not doing this to punish my son, though I knew he would see it that way. I was simply moving our life's work from a place of hollow greed and waste to a place where every dollar would actually mean something. I was sending that money where it could bring a smile to a child's face, or provide a warm meal and a dignified bed for someone who had been forgotten by their own family. I left Oliver his father's collection of old books and the silver pocket watch James had carried for 40 years. These were items of true spiritual value, things I hoped he might one day understand once he finally shed the toxic skin of greed. As for Emma, she would receive exactly what she had sown into my life, and that was absolute emptiness. As I signed the very last page, I felt an almost physical sensation of a massive weight being lifted off my chest. For so many years, I had lived in a constant, quiet state of fear. I had been terrified that if I did not do exactly what my children wanted, I would lose their love forever. But the brutal truth was that I had lost that love a long time ago, the moment they started looking at me as a financial instrument instead of a mother. Now, with Lisa's expert help, I had built a fortress of protection around myself. I would have the resources I needed to stay in this house, the best medical care available, and most importantly, the freedom to give my affection to the people who truly valued it. When I stepped out of the office and back into the bright sunlight of the square, my phone buzzed with a message from Oliver. This time, it was not a threat. It was a desperate whine, telling me that his creditors were at his front door and begging me for just one more rescue. He promised he would change this time. I stopped by a fountain in the middle of the park, watching the water sparkle like diamonds in the sun. I waited for the familiar pang of guilt or the sharp ache in my heart to return, but they never came. I felt nothing but a calm, distant clarity. I typed back a single message. I told him he was a grown man now, and it was time he learned to take responsibility for his own choices. just as I was finally taking responsibility for my own life. I told them not to contact me about money again. I hit send, and for the first time in my life, I felt like the master of my own fate. I walked slowly toward the little cafe where James and I used to sit every Saturday morning. I ordered a latte and a fresh croissant and simply sat there, watching the world go by. I realized that I was not alone at all. I had Lisa, I had Anna, and most importantly, I had myself back. I started making plans for the trips James and I had talked about, but never got to take. I decided I would go to Maine to see the brilliant red of the fall leaves, and then down to Charleston to lose myself in the sound of some good jazz. I was no longer waiting for my children to grant me a few crumbs of their time. At 68 years old, I was beginning a new chapter, one filled with self-respect and a quiet, brilliant strength, where my love would only be given to those who were truly worthy of it. The morning in Savannah was not wet, but the sky was draped in heavy gray clouds that felt like a theater curtain waiting to be raised. I sat in the passenger seat of Lisa's car, my fingers tightly gripping the handle of my handbag, where James's leather diary rested like a sacred weight. Today was the official reading of the will at the legal office. This was where the long, exhausting road of the last few months would finally reach its end. I did not feel the familiar flutter of fear in my stomach anymore. Instead, there was a strange, hollow stillness in my soul. I could feel James somewhere nearby, a presence as steady as the old oaks that lined the streets. To me, that it was time to let the truth speak for itself. When we stepped into the high-ceilinged conference room, the tension was so thick it felt like it might snap. Oliver and Emma were already seated at the polished mahogany table. Emma was dressed in a sleek black outfit that screamed of expensive mourning, but her eyes held a restless, hungry light she couldn't quite hide. She had even brought her own lawyer, a middle-aged man with a sharp, predatory face, who sat checking his watch as if our lives were just another billable hour. Oliver sat beside her, looking gray and hollowed out. The dark circles under his eyes told the story of a man being slowly consumed by the debts he had run up. When Emma saw me, she gave a tiny, practiced nod of greeting, a cold smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. She clearly believed that today was the day she would become a millionaire, the day she could finally discard me like an old piece of furniture and move me into some cut-rate retirement home where I wouldn't be her problem anymore. Lisa began the meeting with the calm, practiced professionalism that commanded the room. She laid the thick stack of papers on the table, the documents that carried James's final breath and the justice he had spent his last months preparing in secret. "Before we get into the specifics of the asset distribution," Lisa said, looking directly at Oliver and then Emma, "I have been authorized by Mr. James to play a short audio recording. This was his personal wish, and he asked that the family hear his words before any legal execution begins." A sudden, heavy silence fell over the room. Emma raised an eyebrow in annoyance, while Oliver let his head sink even lower. The sound of the small speaker on the table for a second, before James's deep, warm voice filled the space. "Margaret, I love you. Oliver, I hope you are listening to this with a heart that has finally woken up." James's voice was so clear, it felt like he was standing right there beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder. "I have spent my entire life building a legacy, not just of money, but of honesty and hard work. But I saw what you and Emma were doing behind your mother's back. I knew about the gambling debts, the cruel words you used when you thought no one was listening, and the plans you made to take what wasn't yours. Money cannot buy a person's character, and I will not allow greed to destroy the things I cherish most in this world." Emma's composure began to crumble. She shot a frantic look at her lawyer, but Lisa was already moving forward, her voice steady and unstoppable. Lisa began to read the terms of the will, and each sentence felt like a hammer blow to Emma's carefully constructed fantasies. The entirety of the cash in the retirement accounts, the stocks, and the diversified investments, a sum totaling more than $2 million, was to be transferred immediately into the James and Margaret Children's Charity Foundation, to be overseen by me and Anna. The house in Savannah was placed into a life tenancy trust that guaranteed I could live there for as long as I breathed, and only after my passing would the property also belong to the charity. Emma bolted upright, her face contorted with a jagged, ugly fury. "This is ridiculous. This cannot be real. That old man must have been out of his mind when he signed this." Her lawyer tried to urge her to sit down, but she had lost all control. She turned on Oliver, screaming at him, demanding to know why he was just sitting there while his father robbed them of their future. Lisa didn't even flinch at the outburst. For Oliver, she continued reading. "Mr. James has left his collection of antique books and his grandfather's silver pocket watch. He stated that he hoped Oliver would learn to value time and knowledge over hollow numbers." Oliver began to cry. It wasn't the loud, angry sob of a loser, but the quiet, broken weeping of a child who finally understood that he had traded the most precious thing he owned for nothing. He looked at me, his lips trembling, but he couldn't find the words. I looked at my son and felt a deep, sharp wave of pity, mixed with an even deeper sorrow. But I didn't stop Lisa. This was the truth he had to face if he was ever going to find his way back to being the man James hoped he would be. Emma's lawyer tried to intervene, suggesting that they would challenge James's mental competency, but Lisa was already several steps ahead. She pulled out a secondary folder containing video evidence of the signing, witnessed by 2 independent psychiatrists, along with James's handwritten diary, which documented every instance of Emma's financial manipulation and emotional pressure. "We have more than enough evidence to show that Mrs. Emma intentionally attempted to exploit Mr. James's finances and placed him under extreme emotional distress," Lisa said, her voice like iron. "If you choose to sue, we are fully prepared to meet you in court with this evidence and a list of your gambling debts to explain your motive." Emma slumped back into her chair, the mask of high society pride finally shattering into 1,000 pieces. She realized in that moment that she didn't just walk away with no money. She was walking away with the threat of a financial fraud investigation hanging over her head. The meeting ended without another word from them. Oliver and Emma walked out of the room like ghosts, not even looking at one another. As Oliver passed my chair, he hesitated for a second, his hand reaching out as if he wanted to touch my arm, but I gently pulled back. "Your father answered for me today, Oliver," I said. "I hope you find your own way now, one that doesn't involve lies." I watched them step into the elevator, and it felt as though a massive, suffocating weight had finally been lifted off my lungs. I turned toward Lisa and Anna, who had been waiting for me in the lobby. Lisa smiled and handed me the keys to my house, the house that was now truly and legally mine, free from the shadows of their greed. Anna pulled me into a long, warm hug, and the heat from her sincere affection made me feel like I was finally, truly alive. We walked out of the building together, stepping into the afternoon sunlight that was finally tearing through the gray clouds. I was no longer the discarded widow Margaret. I was Margaret, a free woman, the keeper of James's legacy, and the person who had just reclaimed her life from the hands of betrayers. Justice had been served, and Savannah had never looked more beautiful in my eyes. 6 months have passed since that life-altering day in the legal office, and Savannah is basking in the golden glow of a midsummer afternoon. The heavy silence that once haunted Margaret's home like a shroud has been replaced by the vibrant and healing sounds of life. From the back garden, the bright laughter of children from the Charity Foundation drifts through the open windows as they work alongside Anna to tend to the towering sunflowers that now line the weathered wooden fence. Margaret stands on her porch, holding a warm tray of her signature peach cobbler, the sweet scent of cinnamon and ripened fruit acting as a fragrant testament to the joy she has finally rediscovered. She no longer spends her hours staring at a silent phone or waiting for a call that only ever came with a hidden price tag. Instead, she is busy finalizing her autumn travel plans with Lisa, looking forward to a long-awaited trip to New England to see the changing leaves, a dream she had set aside for nearly half her life just to put the ungrateful needs of others first. Oliver is now living in South Carolina, working at a shipyard. He is starting over from the very bottom, far away from Emma's toxic and calculating influence. It was a harsh and lonely price to pay for the truth, but it was the only way for him to truly grow and reclaim his own dignity through honest labor. Margaret's story may be coming to a close, but the message it leaves behind is a powerful light for all of us. There is an old saying that family is where you are born, but your true family is where you are actually loved and cherished. Margaret had to walk a long and painful road to realize that blood connection is not always stronger than a sincere empathy of those we choose to let into our hearts. She chose to protect herself, to honor James's legacy, and most importantly, to claim her right to happiness in the quiet sunset of her life. The greatest lesson we can take from her journey is that sacrifice only has true value when it is placed where it is respected and returned. Never let a blind love turn you into a victim of ingratitude. Seeking justice for yourself is not an act of revenge. It is the way we establish the boundaries that allow us to live a life of self-respect. Margaret is no longer alone because she learned the most important secret of all. You must learn to love and value yourself before you wait for the rest of the world to do it for you. After listening to Margaret's entire journey, how do you feel? Was there a moment where you saw a piece of yourself or someone you love in the reflection of this story? What is the most profound lesson or message you are taking away for your own life today? Please share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below, because I am always here to listen and connect with you. Thank you so much for being part of this story today. I look forward to reading your messages and seeing how Margaret's strength has touched your own heart.